Warning: the following content may contain elements that are not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
All right.
Hi.
Good. Are you ready?
Go for it.
We're on? Okay. So I want to thank you again for coming because I know it's been kind of hectic.
It's
but
fantastic.
I would like to introduce you, if you don't mind,
Go ahead.
to the future audiences of
Okay.
the world. What's the proper way? It's a licensed social worker, right? You're a licensed
I'm a
social worker.
licensed clinical social worker.
A licensed clinical social worker. Okay. So just to introduce you formally,
Yes.
how do you pronounce your last name?
So it's Leah Travers Pucci.
Okay.
I had to hyphenate it.
Sure.
Yeah. And I have my licensed clinical, so I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and currently I'm working with a private practice doing one-on-one therapy.
How long have you been doing that?
Like over the last 4 or 5 years. And prior, I was a school social worker, and worked with K-12 students and their families, and did a lot of community work as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a pretty good resume.
It's a good resume.
Yeah. Okay. So now that I have you on, the whole thing, I don't know if I talked to you about what the whole goal was. I think
Yeah, we did. We did talk.
and what the goal was for me anyway was to kind of give some sort of professional feedback on perhaps experiences that people might have that they have questions about, and maybe in the future we can have people, send in their questions. Like, that's actually your idea. I want to credit you.
Hey, good job.
There you go. I want to credit you for that.
Thank you.
Because that was your idea. It's like, why don't we just take questions from people, which is great. That wasn't a thing I could do before because I didn't have a professional on until now. So now we can actually do that, and that is another goal now. That's fantastic. It's a far greater goal than what I had in mind before, which was, hey, can we get enough people to tell their stories, and maybe we can help people that way, which
Absolutely.
I still want to do.
Yes.
I still want to do that. I just want to make sure that we have some sort of feedback, professional feedback, and say, hey, maybe we can address this and that in ways that I couldn't address. You know what I mean?
Right. Yes.
So that I guess was the main goal with having you on, and now we're here.
Thank you.
So I guess what I want to get started with for this episode is I want to focus more on generational trauma. And we did talk a little bit about it before in the lead up to this episode. And I just kind of wanted to dig a little deeper from what I know about it.
Absolutely.
And as I understand it, generational trauma can show up in many different ways, and sometimes it hides it shows up in people differently.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
From your experience, where can generational trauma show up in adulthood versus childhood?
That's a very good place to start. But first, I think it's really cool that you have set the foundation to have these open conversations. Because I think that there's definitely a need, and there are different platforms that people have to have these conversations, but maybe not as readily available as we need it to be. So nice job.
Thank you.
That's really cool that you're doing this.
I'm super grateful that I've had I didn't even expect, help from a professional. That was just something that I got last minute. So,
I know that was just a neat way to connect with people.
Yeah. So thank you. Cause at the end of the day, I can't do this by myself. I've had friends, for example, my friend Josh, that's currently working the cameras. Thank you, sir. I've had my other friends, and my mom has helped out with this. My cousin designed this thing.
Oh, that's cool.
So it's an
effort.
It's a group effort, because that's kind of what I think it is at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
It's a human effort, and it's not necessarily my maybe I'm the host in this scenario, but certainly this is a human effort. And so yeah, thank you. I couldn't do this by myself.
Very cool. So back to your question, if I got it straight, right? Like, how does generational trauma show up in adults as opposed to in children?
Yes.
And to kind of, have you previously addressed like what generational trauma is?
No. So at least not on the show.
Okay.
This is kind of my first time diving into it. That's why I kind of wanted to wait so that I didn't want to say something that was just my opinion and not backed by some sort of professional feedback.
Yes. So that's probably a good place to start, right? Okay. Briefly, is generational trauma is trauma passed down from parents to children, from children to their children, in various different reasons, or for various different reasons. And it could be anything from adult survivors of the Holocaust and their trauma that has been imposed on them through their parents. So parents who have survived the Holocaust and their children having children, and how that trauma is transformed through the generations in terms of even parenting styles. So not necessarily I'm sharing this horrific story with you and you've created trauma, but how that trauma affected that person. The original trauma affected the person who experienced it, to then how they interact and view the world and safety and things like that.
It gets really skewed as generations go, doesn't it? Like, it seems like what you just said was the perception of that child, of what that experience was, is different than perhaps what that person experienced. So I guess everybody experiences that trauma differently. I'm trying to get at. I don't know if that.
So it's, yes, but another example. So, and excuse me, because I wrote some examples down, if you don't mind, just so that I wasn't misspeaking as well. But when you look at generational trauma, again, it's not just experienced by one person, like the person who had that direct interaction with the trauma. So the generational pieces, again, if I'm the Holocaust survivor and I'm then parenting my child, how I parent my child may come from a place of trauma. So I may be super overprotective. I may come from the perception of, the world is a very unsafe place. So I'm not telling the trauma story. I may not be describing my experience with my child, but how I parent comes from a place of trauma. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah.
So the child then will interact with their world in that way, and it's more likely to carry on some of those traits in their world and how they interact with the world.
So I like analogies, because analogies kind of help me understand the world. So then it's almost like the cage that they grew up in, they put their children in that cage, and they cannot go past the cage, and so they raise their kids in that cage. Is that kind of in the ballpark? In the ballpark. Okay. So yes. I think maybe that's a low resolution version of it, but that's kind of how when I hear that, that's how I hear it. Okay. It's like, is it like, so what's the more accurate way to say that?
So, and I work by examples as well. Let's say there's, a traumatic event. You can think of larger events like the Holocaust, like the genocide in Rwanda, slavery in America. Those are very traumatic times, events that people experienced. So how they experience that, again, impacts how they would then interact with other people.
That is so crazy. So essentially, some people could still be experiencing trauma from past, from wars, and they passed on that form of teaching or that form of coping, I guess.
So here's another example that maybe explains it on a more personal level. If you have a parent who's been in a war, whether it was whatever it was, right? Like my dad was in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. He had experienced a lot of trauma, PTSD. I never heard stories about Vietnam as a child. That was not a part of my childhood, knowing about his experience in Vietnam. Some of his behaviors may have shaped how he parented us in terms of things being everything had to be very clean and very tidy. Mm-hmm. And I could go on with different examples, but so it's that experience that he had and how it impacted him, and then how he then in turn interacted with the world around him when he came home.
Sure.
Right. And you'll hear this a lot about military who have a lot of trauma, and how they interact is difficult. Like their integration back into general population, right, can be very difficult because of the trauma they've experienced.
I'll say that, well, from my experience, and I didn't go to war. I was what I would call a peacetime Marine.
Okay.
So I wasn't in a situation where I have this experience, this trauma of war. But what I will say, and I did have time in the reserves, in the Marine Corps reserves. That's where I spent my career. And even that, I thought it was going to be easy transitioning because I'm already half living the civilian life.
Right.
I go, it's called drill every month, once a month, it's 1 week in a month, and then 2 weeks out of the summer.
Right.
So I thought, well, I've built my civilian life while I've been building my military life. So it should be almost like a even transaction, I thought.
Interesting.
And it wasn't. Since I've been out, and it's gotten easier as time has passed, and obviously I've gone to therapy too, and that's helped a lot. But for me, there was still a missing link, almost like a loss of community. Because essentially that's what it is.
Absolutely.
People that don't speak the same language as you, I guess is the best way I would put that. There are certain conversations that I can't have, like in terms of, we have a very dark humor in the military.
Yes.
So
I didn't mean to smile.
No, yeah. Yes. We have a very dark sense of humor because in a war setting, that's what gets you through the reality you live in. That's kind of the idea that I've gotten from my time, is that dark humor carries through hard experiences. So it's easier to go through what you're going through if you're laughing about it. The saying,
yes,
you could either laugh or cry.
Yes.
And that's kind of the route that's taken, is we don't want to cry. So, well, you don't have the option to cry. So
right.
You might as well laugh.
Or you get angry.
Yeah, that is another way. But for me, I guess humor was a way that I dealt with hard things in that community. And it's not like we did anything crazy, but when you work under stressful situations, which you will, and no matter what you do in the military, it's just everything is hurry up and wait is what we call it.
Yes, a lot of bureaucracy.
Yes, it's hurry up and wait, and the hurry up part is the stressful part, obviously. And so you kind of bond with people that way. And that's the way that I bonded with a lot of my Marines as we went through stuff. We were in the rain sometimes setting stuff up, and it was cold. And the only way we could get through it is if we just laughed.
Right.
And so that's how we coped with stuff like that. So when that kind of went away, there was a missing link there. And those were kind of the few people that understood me well. Right. Because you could show up as whatever you were, because that's kind of, you just become a family essentially.
Yes.
So that's what I would say was difficult, and I was surprised was difficult, because like I said, I had a civilian life.
Right.
So I was like, this shouldn't be difficult.
It's such a different environment though.
It is.
Right. And that also can mirror kind of part of what you're saying is that community piece. And when they talk about generational trauma, that community of people who've been through a larger scale trauma, and not having that community, and how do you shift back into your world, right? There was some research done on survivors of the tsunami, and how that experience impacted them, and then again, like how they parented their children, and how that kind of got passed down. There's also some kind of upcoming research in terms of how trauma impacts your, I'm going to say this wrong, not your DNA. It's almost like a chemical reaction. Not being a neuroscientist, I'm not communicating this correctly, but
yeah.
It's almost changes, like if I experience massive trauma and have PTSD, something happens chemically in me, right? So then that can genetically be passed down to my child.
I have heard that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then she is predisposed to responding differently to traumatic events. And they've had some really interesting studies that have been going on in just tracking blood work, and following people and their children and other people within those experiences, and how, not genetically, but how it has impacted them physiologically.
I see. So it rewires their brain's reaction to trauma.
Yes.
I see.
Yes.
That, yeah. Wow. That's something I didn't, that's something I hadn't considered. Is that also, well, I mean, that would make sense, because if you believe in evolution, then that would correlate with, animals evolve to avoid certain predators. Right. And so it hardwires, it's a survival thing, because at the end of the day, I think trauma is like a survival experience, is it not?
It can be,
at least your brain
explain. Yes. That when you experience, so everyone experiences some sort of trauma.
Yeah.
Like every single person.
Yeah.
How they interpret or make meaning of the trauma is very different. And then you can develop PTSD. So PTSD are symptoms of trauma, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you can manage and kind of cure PTSD with certain therapies, but it doesn't mean the trauma is going to go away.
Right.
Right. You'll always have that trauma. But dealing with the PTSD, the goal would be you're not living your life from the place of trauma, right? So someone who maybe was abused growing up and they have PTSD and they go through treatment, the goal would be that as a young adult moving forward, you would be able to interact with people, kind of engage in your life from a place of healing, right? Like someone who maybe has experienced abuse, they're not going to be as trusting, right?
Right.
So how they interact with people, how how they view the world and safety is so altered by that. If you are able to heal those pieces and have those conversations and be a part of community that is able to help heal you, then you can ideally move forward, right? And that trauma is still there, but it's not the forefront. It's not how you're making decisions or living your life.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because so far my goal has been aligned with the idea that we're having a lot of times with what's going on, for example, in modern politics. You see it in politics, you can see it anywhere.
Right.
Is that there's such a strong emotional reaction going on with a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And for the longest time, and this is just from my own personal experience too, is, I feel like I've been arguing with a wall, because essentially when I've had conversations with, for example, significant others and I've had disagreements, there was an emotional response to the topic. And yet when I would discuss the topic, mm-hmm. I would essentially figure out the logic and, okay, well then if this, then that, right? And that's my black and white view of the world that unfortunately was one of the issues. It's just that life isn't black and white like that.
Right.
And that's one thing that I've learned. But with that being said, that because things are not black and white, mm-hmm. therefore those are surface topics. I think yes, that's important to you, but why? I guess was the question that wasn't being asked. And so my goal is, and so my view that aligns to my goal is that essentially I feel like we're having the wrong conversation, if that makes sense. I feel like that is only the surface topic and not the real underlying cause of your emotional reaction. I feel almost as though this is almost like in the way that I understand it is in your nervous system is responding like you're in danger.
Yes.
And that's because of your trauma.
Yeah. It's that fight
or flight.
Yeah. And there's freeze.
Yes.
Right. You can't necessarily, if whatever the conversation is, you can't necessarily respond.
Yeah.
And it's almost, you just freeze, right? And you kind of go blank, or that anxiety kicks in and you can't necessarily engage in the conversation because that's also, yes, a trauma response. And I need to keep myself safe, so I don't do anything.
I've run into that, mm-hmm. and I didn't understand it because my response mm-hmm. is different. Mm-hmm. My response to danger is to act quickly. To respond quickly and figure out a solution. And a lot of times the polar opposite to that is freeze.
Yes. Or flight.
Yes, or flight.
Right.
And that's what I wasn't used to. And I guess one of the motivators that pushed me into figuring out more as to why that was so bizarre to me, why that was so, it was like a different language. I couldn't understand the reasoning behind certain behaviors.
When did you notice the behaviors?
I noticed them basically like in arguments is the freezing, mm-hmm. is having disagreements and noticing that person just would freeze. And I see that as you agree with me.
Oh, that would make sense to some people, right? Like if there's, I'm assuming a conversation or a disagreement and the person doesn't respond, right? You're assuming, like you said, okay, they understand or they don't disagree.
Yes.
Because they're not saying anything in return.
And I mean, I ended up figuring that part out later. But the problem, I guess, is that the damage gets done when that's, just over time keeps happening. And, I think I'm resolving the problem because nothing's being said. and then to find out that the problem isn't being resolved. And in fact, it's been building.
Right.
And so I guess that's another thing that really made me feel like I'm not really addressing the problem.
Neither is the other person,
Yes.
though, as well, right? Like, I think sometimes when you maybe you've experienced some trauma, and then you're in a relationship and communication is a struggle.
Yep.
Or you don't realize it's a struggle, and then something happens and you do, right? I mean, we're kind of being vague, but that's okay. I think
Yeah.
you're following right?
Sure.
Then that other person has either frozen because they're not responding or interacting. So you don't know, right? I mean, so much of, I think, healing trauma is working on communication.
Yes.
And especially when it comes to, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've done or worked with, either adults or children, has focused on how do we communicate and how do we use our words to create a safe space, and be able to tolerate feeling uncomfortable in communication.
Yes.
So that you can manage and try to understand the other person or the perspective.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. And I guess that's been the goal for this, is the communication piece of when those things arise, because when somebody gets activated like that, right, when they have an emotional response to something that you believe in or whatever you associate with, I think that if we could just maybe recognize what's behind it, maybe we could have a different conversation, and not one that is of, I'm trying to protect myself, because
Right.
that's like I don't trust you. And I do think that has something to do with communication, or a lack thereof. And so
Or allowing space
Sure.
for people to ask questions, and to try to not feel threatened when people ask you questions.
Yes.
Right. Because I think that can feel attacking
Yes.
without that being the intention.
Sure.
So, you just sharing your experience of, being in the reserves. If I started asking you a bunch of questions, that may feel like really intimidating or uncomfortable for you. You could shut down, you could get angry, you could just be dismissive. And how would that interact, or how would that then impact our interaction, right?
Sure.
Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Ideally, you would maybe address how you were feeling, right? Like, I'm not sure the intent of your question, or give me a minute, I need to think about that. Like, how can you engage in those conversations when you are feeling triggered?
Yeah.
And that's where I think recognizing some issues to deal with trauma, doing the therapy, finding community and support is so important to continue those conversations. And just being aware of what are your triggers and how do you advocate for yourself in those situations, so that you're honoring how you feel and also kind of what's happening around you.
I think you kind of were saying what I was thinking about, which is that it really is, it starts with you as an individual, like to heal yourself so that you can better understand not only yourself but others. Mm-hmm. I think that's what's helped me is with therapy. With understanding more about why I respond in the ways that I do, I've gotten better at recognizing that in others. And with the couple of episodes that I've done already, I've noticed similarities in responses to my friends. And I'm like, that might be another reason we're close, is because we think a lot alike and respond to things in similar manners. But I'd like to also understand how others outside of that respond. And maybe by understanding ourselves a little better, and I guess that's the reason why I want to have guests on, right, is to ask why, at least. You know, I'm not a therapist, nor will I ever claim to be any kind of professional. All I want to do is to start a conversation of, why did that hurt? And maybe by asking that question, we can interact a little bit better next time, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think that's an important question to ask. And people aren't, we're talking in generalities, of course, right? Yeah. I don't know if people are used to being asked that question, right? It's, think about how many times you say to somebody like, hey, how are you? How's your day going? And they always say fine, or it's great. Do you ever really get a more in-depth response of, you know, yeah, started off terrible, blah, 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 but now it's okay? Or, and of course it depends on your relationship, but it's that, I'm sorry to hear you're having a bad day, or, you know, you're sharing an experience. Why did that hurt you? Though that's not a typical question that I think people hear, and it is a little uncomfortable, but it's working through that level of discomfort.
And then that's another question I guess I have too, is for the discomfort part. I see what you're talking about with, when you're, let's say, for example, you said it a little bit earlier. You say something that bothers me, and maybe offended me, and I have a immediate response of, don't say anything, of just like, you know, you keep that to yourself because you don't want to seem rude. At least that's how I kind of was raised, was that's manners. Right. Is that if something bothers you, let's say somebody says something rude, you know, you don't be rude back type situation, where, but it's not rude to ask for clarification, or to say, hey, you know what, that made me uncomfortable, or that bothered me. And maybe it's because there's fear that that person won't, when you say that to them, maybe they get upset, and go, well, that's not what I meant. And then there's this fear of starting a problem. Yeah. Yes, that's absolutely kind of how I feel about, like, this is just me thinking about trying to put myself in that situation and what my immediate response would be, which is that, I think, is don't be rude. Right. And I think asking for clarification is a great way around feeling rude, right? Because we also want to, there's so many things that we're trying to be in tune with, right? From honoring ourselves to not making other people uncomfortable. And that gets really tricky because we don't always know what's going to make somebody else uncomfortable. And of course, right, we always want to be aware of our audience or where we're at, or just common courtesy. Sure. Yeah, I was having a conversation with a friend, and they were having a conversation with somebody, and it was about kind of a political hot topic. And a week or two after that conversation, the person had gone back to my friend and said, you know, I was really offended. I didn't give you permission to talk to me about that. And I was like, wow, that's pretty powerful. In terms of, if I actually don't have words for it at the moment. I wasn't sure. Yeah. Because I think that's a very confusing thing, right? In terms of, I didn't give you permission to talk to me about that. I connect with that. I've felt that before and never said that. Well, and so my friend was really upset that this had happened. Not upset at the just upset in general, right? Because it may continue to impact the friendship. And my initial thought was, wow, you're responsible how you feel. And
if something's uncomfortable in the moment and the other person doesn't know that, how do you manage that, right?
Yeah.
It's almost a sense of people being afraid to say anything because they don't want to offend anybody.
Yes.
And that was kind of the conversation that my friend and I started having was, wow, what can you talk about without putting yourself or somebody else in that situation? Which kind of have shifted our conversation. Sorry, but it just stemmed from there in terms of how do you proceed with conversations that are uncomfortable.
Yes.
Or you're uncomfortable with, and that's not the intent of the other person.
Right.
Right. So instead of that freeze, figuring out a way to kind of advocate for yourself, I guess, in those moments.
But isn't there an inherent risk when, with sharing ideas with others, that there's always the possibility that, I guess the issue I would think is not that you might risk offending somebody, because I think that that's always going to be there.
Agreed.
But that when that happens, both parties can communicate in a way in which you could come to at least a consensus of some sort, of an agreement of, hey, this is okay, this is not okay, and at least establish boundaries that are.
Sometimes it's you have to agree to disagree. Yeah, and that's okay.
Right, is that like part of the setting boundaries part where you say, hey, this is not something that I want to go no further than here, I guess, in conversation.
I guess so. Yes, yes, that could happen. It doesn't mean the other person is necessarily going to respond to that. So you only control how you act and how you respond to things or people in your environment. You don't control them at all. So understanding that piece, I think, then allows you to engage in a more comfortable way, knowing, okay, if this isn't going well, or I'm feeling really, disrespected or upset or uncomfortable, I'm responsible for how I respond in this situation. So I can choose to step out of it. I can choose to engage differently. And that's being in touch and being able to regulate yourself in those moments. And when you've kind of had a lot of exposure to trauma, that's hard to do. Yeah. Right? Is to kind of regulate and figure out where are some of those feelings coming from.
Right. Now to get back on topic, because I know that we did veer off a little bit. And by the way, I do that a lot. So
that's fantastic.
That's just how my brain is
yes, it goes.
That idea, this idea, what about that idea?
Right.
So anyway, so then how does generational trauma then show up, let's say in early childhood, and then how does it develop into adulthood? We did touch on how that evolves into parenting, but
So I think as we see that in children sometimes, maybe they're more anxious, a higher rate of depression, maybe some difficulties in school or in social situations, for whatever that might look like. Again, we're being kind of broad, without specific examples. But if you think of different groups of people, so, and I work well with examples, like immigrants recently from the Ukraine, right? And that example is not necessarily like long-term generational trauma, but if you look at the parents and the trauma and having to leave your home, and those children and them having experienced this trauma, how might they interact at school, right? They maybe might be more reserved or shy,
Sure.
Not feeling super safe. So they might be more anxious. So paying attention or just being aware of some of those behaviors can help kids in social situations, like specifically school. Where do they spend most of their time?
Right.
So there's a lot of focus and a lot of work on creating trauma-informed schools and classrooms to help all certain bleep that part out.
Yeah. That's okay. You can make mistakes.
Oh my gosh. Like trauma-informed care in classrooms to help navigate some of those issues.
It's interesting you bring that up because that's one of the issues that Josh and I actually talked about was he had a hard time in schools because teachers didn't understand, any different kind of issues, how it shows up in kids and what that means. And so a lot of times they think, well, this kid is just, misbehaving or being, not properly raised at home or, and while that always can be the case, I think that, there's always the anxiety showing up in kids where they might tap their hands a lot or tap their feet. Or I know I used to do that because I was a very anxious kid. And now I understand that has to do with my own trauma and that's anxiety has shown up in all the way up to adulthood for me. And I didn't know that, the tapping or doing that was anxiety driven.
Right.
And maybe a teacher thinks, well, you're just not raised well. But that's not the case. I was raised to a very high standard. And so that wasn't necessarily the problem. And I guess that's what Josh and I were really getting at was, well, he was telling me because I didn't experience that. But yeah, what's going to be helpful, I think, for kids is to have teachers that are trained in understanding what those signs are.
Absolutely. And that brings a whole nother topic of these, our educators, there's so much that they have to be aware of. And that's why there's so many other personnel in schools to help children or to recognize different behaviors or maybe attached to different things. Not a perfect system by all means, but I think sometimes our teachers get a little too much grief in terms of not, paying attention or this or that. Like there's so much going on. It's so hard to be as inclusive as we ideally want everything to be. So, yeah, I mean, it shows up, like you said, in tapping, in behavior, in overachieving, right? I mean, there might be kids who have alcoholic parents at home or a single parent or an abusive parent, and their outlet is school. So they're super social, very high achieving. They're in all the activities or sports because they don't want to be at home, right? So I can say this, and then I don't want people to think, oh, every overachieving child is having something at home. No, not at all. It's just to talk about like how it shows up differently, right? You could have the anxious, withdrawn, depressed child. You could have just kind of the silent one, right? There's kind of the kids that fly under the radar, all the way to the super achieving student that is involved with everything because they don't want to be at home.
And I think that that's where the whole understanding yourself part is the most important. I think to start, I guess we can kind of start to address the larger problem at hand, I guess, is that ultimately it starts with the individual, and at the individual level, and understanding, controlling what you can, which is you. And if everybody does that, then perhaps we could get a little bit better at understanding each other, I guess.
Yeah. And it's understanding developmentally when that's appropriate.
Okay,
right?
that's another question.
Yeah.
How do you know, or at what point is that?
That's a good question. But we can't expect a first grader or a seventh grader to be totally in tune with who they are, because
Right.
they're not.
No.
Right? Research talks about our brains are not fully developed into adult brains until we're 25 or 27.
Yep.
So when you think about, and that's like the typical person. So add anything else, like very traumatic experiences, ADHD, depression, anxiety, that then impacts as well too.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know. There's not a great answer for that. It is individual. And of course we have like developmental milestones, and we have all the research about child development and brain development. And so there are guidelines, of course, but there's always outliers to that.
Because this is what I've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong. I've seen that, perhaps there is, having those words, or having early in life, having the word, saying, like diagnosing yourself. I've seen a lot of at a very young age, and not understanding what those things actually mean, and then throwing the words lightly around. And so it almost becomes like, I've seen it used in a form of manipulation. And I guess that makes things a little more complicated, because that's why I was asking at what age, because there is a issue with not having the right information.
Yes.
And especially when you're young, you're still figuring yourself out. And when everybody starts throwing words lightly around that are not light,
right,
it becomes a big problem, I think, in the way of that we understand what that means. And I think that that's also an important thing to cover, is the understanding what those things actually mean, and understanding yourself, so you know if that's true or not before you start throwing it around. Because I do think that some of these, let's say, for example, I've heard a lot of people say that they are bipolar, or you're a psychopath, like calling people that as a derogatory term, and not having the knowledge of what that actually entails is harmful, I think.
Agreed.
And so then what is I don't know if there's a right way necessarily to handle that, but what's a better way that you know of to manage those situations for younger folks?
I think it comes back to that, I don't know if like corrective conversation, if that kind of makes sense. To backtrack just a little, in parenting and working with children, there's going to be disagreement, right? Just by nature. We're going to correct younger people. We're going to correct our kids.
Right.
Discipline is meaningful when you come back together after and heal and move forward.
I see.
Right? In my experience and in my training and working with families, it's not just about you said something wrong, you're grounded, or I'm taking this away from you, that doesn't do anything except tell the child you did something wrong, right?
Sure.
Where's the healing part of that? Is kind of coming back as an adult and a child, a parent figure, a child, whatever adult child, that is. And having a brief conversation, because of course, like we're talking, who knows what age, right? You have to be age appropriate. We're not going to have a 10-minute lecture with a 7-year-old, right? They're going to hear this much of it.
Right.
So it's just coming back and having that moment of, okay, this is what happened, or this is why, maybe you said this thing, and that's hurtful because, and let's work on that, right? Or I'm here to help you. I love you. And that's it. Let's move on, right? So you have to come back, restore, confirm that they're safe, you're safe for them, you love them, and move forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So then there can be an issue when that process is incomplete. So like, for example, only the punishment and the reasoning for the punishment isn't explained after the fact is the cause of that issue, right? The break in communication there.
Yeah, I think it helps with communication and understanding, and that can go to, like you said, if there's name calling or someone's using a diagnosis as derogatory, right? Like, oh, you're bipolar, you act so crazy, or the other example you had given. But so if a young person says that to like one of their friends, they don't really maybe understand totally what they're saying, right? That's what we're kind of assuming.
Right.
So then it is, how do you have that conversation, right? And sometimes when it is a young child, sometimes you use like the medical model perspective, really. Like if someone does have a disability, ADHD, and the child's taking medication and that's difficult, or they're being teased, whatever happens, right? There are times I look at that with that child and the family. I'm like, well, from the medical model, if you had diabetes, you would take medicine, right? You have a chemical imbalance. You're going to have a holistic approach of, let me eat well, rest, let me take care of my body, right? Physically, emotionally, mentally, and also with medication. And that can balance kind of the whole person, right? Did that make sense?
So the education piece is important.
Huge.
Right.
Huge.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. So then, because, well, that would show up in I would imagine in the younger, when the years of when kids ask why a lot.
Oh, yes.
I think that's also a problem too, is that eventually, parents get fed up with that question, and at some point they stopped asking why. And I think that's also generational trauma. In
what way? What do you mean?
Is for example, I don't want to give anybody up, but a certain somebody couldn't stand hearing why too many times, and eventually that child will stop asking why, and just assume, or whatever they learn from what they hear, then they start repeating that. And then, that must be the answer because you can't really ask why because that's annoying or whatever.
Okay.
And I think, in my opinion, from what I've noticed is, and I guess that's also a question, is that a form of generational trauma where we've stopped asking why?
I'm thinking.
Yeah, of course.
Because there is if you're just looking at that, I don't know if that's a valid, not valid, but no, right? Like all kids ask why, parents get sick of it, or a teachers or whoever it is, right? And they're like, well, I've answered that, or don't ask me again, or, you know, whatever that response is. Mm-hmm. Does that create trauma? No, not all the time, mm-hmm. right? Are there situations where it does cause trauma? Yes, but what's that situation? Mm. Does that make sense?
So that's too broad of a question? A little,
maybe. But because I think we can say things, right? And I guess that's part of it, is how do we have these conversations without completely labeling all these different interactions as traumatic when they're not for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I hope that made sense. Because certainly as a child, like if you're asking why and you're getting punished for that, you're getting yelled at for it, and there's other circumstances, or that's an ongoing thing, or there's different factors influencing what's happening in the family, right? That can create kind of a sense of not feeling safe. Like I can't ask questions, not knowing isn't good, right? Like there's some basic kind of safety factors that someone may interpret from those type of situations, looking at the whole situation, right? It's just like kind of, Josh and I were talking before we started, and we were talking about like diagnoses and how people get diagnosed with things. It's not just based on one question or one rating scale or something. You have to look at the whole story, right? Like there's a whole history. And that's important when you're having some of these conversations too.
I see. Okay. So yeah, that's I guess the challenge for me is, and I'm still trying to figure out like what's really going on, I guess, is really where I'm at right now, is what's really going on. And I guess that's why it's still an issue, because there's not a size fits all type answer.
Right.
For those situations. So I guess, yeah, then the right way to approach it is to see how that individual is affected by that specific experience, right?
Right, because you could have 2 or 3 siblings, right, growing up in a household, and they all experience that very, very differently, right? I consider myself very lucky in having a good childhood. I didn't have parents that were drinking or abusive. We very much were kind of typical middle class, right? But interesting, because my sister and I will, like when we talk about our childhood, see it so differently. And there are things that I'm like, oh, remember this? She's like, oh, I don't even know what you're talking. No, what? Like, I have no clue we did that. I'm like, how could you not remember that? So there's like that normal, I would say that for us, that's kind of that normal, we just see things differently, right? If you add different, more traumatic family dynamics, that can be even more diverse in terms of how people experience that, right? One person might be completely devastated, and that really shakes them and their experience in childhood, young adulthood, like whenever that happens. And another sibling might kind of be like, I'm fine. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. So, trauma affects everybody differently, and that's been the case based off of like my siblings, for example. Is everybody's responded to it in their own unique way,
right?
And yeah, okay. Well, we are coming up on our hour.
Wow,
so
went by fast.
Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of wrap up with, what is your message that you have for people in this regard?
In regards to generational trauma,
Yes.
I think and you had worded it very nicely before, and so I'm going to butcher it, I think, but being aware of yourself and your interactions with others. And it's hard to be self-aware, right? Yeah. And I think that can be very scary at times. But if you are at a certain point in your life and you are struggling with the relationships, or you're struggling at work, or like maybe there's just kind of a level of like discomfort in your life, being able to be reflective on that and kind of asking yourself some hard questions, right? Or getting into therapy and trying to maybe look at where that's coming from. Ask me your question again.
that was you were answering it.
Okay.
Yes. That question is essentially what is your advice, your message to those people regarding generational trauma, and what?
So those people, meaning people who are experiencing it,
listening, that have experienced it.
The self-awareness, and sometimes listening to others, right? Which can be really hard. Especially when we're in a reactive state. We may hear some messages along the way of how we're interacting with our world that is maybe impulsive or whatever that is. Being able to hear that is really hard. Yeah. Right? Have you experienced that where somebody's giving
all
you
the time.
Feedback and you're just like, that's not me.
Yes.
So sometimes we got to let our ego go.
Oh, thank you.
That is that's practice.
That's been very hard for me.
Absolutely. Yes. So having, again, those conversations and being aware of our behaviors, and when we're interacting with others, being aware, where's that coming from, right? Is it coming from a place of trauma, or is it coming from a place of wellness? And how do we evaluate that? So I think that's an ongoing conversation, very individual for people. If you look at broader events in the world that are traumatic, then we have a group of people that might need specific support during times of transition. And that's a whole nother conversation.
That's a good endpoint.
Okay.
Because it is an ongoing conversation, and I appreciate you coming out and
this was great,
and doing this episode, and hopefully I do get to work with you in the future, and
fantastic.
And maybe we can answer some questions for other people that have their own questions, just like I did.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can shed some light on some of the dark times for them.
Absolutely. This is great. You're doing this. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Great work.
Thanks. All right. That's it. That's an hour.
We've won the night.
That's all right. We've won the night.